Hello everyone and welcome to my channel YNR Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Secrets, distrust, and the slow-burning crackle of treachery threatened to erupt made Genoa City's air feel heavier than usual. With the exception of the lighting from a solitary lamp that was left on in Lily's office, the Chancellor Winter's offices were silent after hours. Earlier that day, Kane Ashby stood over her desk, her hands trembling and her veins throbbing with barely restrained anger. But not there, but at the Grand Phoenix, where Phyllis Summers thought she had finally won, would come the shock that was going to shake the entire city. With her cunning grins and audacious calculations, Phyllis believed she had positioned herself in a position of authority once more. But for weeks the walls had been closing in. Private investigators conducting shady investigations, bank accounts being cross-checked, and rumors being circulated. And all of a sudden, Kane had it all. The awful secret. The deception. In order to save her own future and destroy Kane's, she had been quietly tugging strings behind his back. Because she was always so certain that she was only a few steps ahead, Phyllis never thought the truth would come to light. Kane, however, had been observing. And he felt as though something had been broken when the evidence, the falsified witness accounts, the fabricated paperwork, and the meticulously staged affair photos that were intended to destroy him, finally appeared in his hands. It was not a business treachery. It was intimate. It was vicious. It was intentional. That night, Phyllis sat in the Phoenix Lounge with her legs crossed and a martini in hand. Her laugh reverberated with that special mix of charm and caution that only she could pull off. Tucker McCall and her were meeting, chatting away chess notes and smirking casually about who would be useful, who might be expendable, and who could be pushed aside. She saw Kane as an impediment that would finally be overcome, not a threat. As she drew closer to Tucker, her lips twisted in that self-assured smirk, Kane came into the lobby. She saw him right away, and her face shifted from fright to curiosity. As she stood slowly and straightened the lapels of her crimson jacket like a queen arranging her crown, she muttered, "Well, well, this is not what I expected." At first, Kane remained silent. He had too quiet, too hollow, and too dark eyes. And that tightened Phyllis's stomach more than any explosion. Storms were her favorite. She could outrun storms. There was weight in silence. Silence was a sign of peril. Tucker nodded slowly and excused himself, feeling tension that was thick enough to cut. He was even aware of when to avoid being present for whatever new pandemonium was going to break out. At last, Kane spoke. "You took everything from me." In a quiet, measured voice that vibrated like a wire that had been drawn too tightly. With that usual edge of defiance rising, Phyllis raised her chin. "Come on, Kane. Whatever you believe you've discovered, however," he interrupted her. "No more falsehoods." He tossed the folder onto the glossy marble table between them. Pictures poured out. Emails. Money exchanges. These were never his signatures. She paid someone to fake legal testimony. The fact that Phyllis had planned the accident that drove Kane into a downward spiral months ago, an accident that almost cost him his children, his sobriety, his work, and his sanity, was the worst detail of all, and it hurt even more than the betrayal itself. It wasn't destiny. It hadn't been negligence. Phyllis had been the one. Her face went white. Words deserted her as she attempted to recoup, defend, twist, and spin. The reinvention queen Phyllis Summers could not speak. "Kane, I didn't intend for it to go that bad. I wanted to ensure that you didn't, to destroy you," he concluded. "Everything revolved around you." He lowered his voice to a whisper that rocked her more than a roar ever could. "You nearly ruined my family." Her pride swelled as a last line of defense, but Phyllis swallowed. "I took the necessary action. To protect yourself, don't pretend you've never lied." For a moment Kane's eyes closed, and behind them flashed the memories of all his own errors. He had lied, really. He had cheated once, indeed. He had let Lily and the children down, indeed. However, he was now different. He had rebuilt. He had battled for atonement. Phyllis hadn't. She had stepped up her efforts. All the knives were sharpened by her. And she had done it with a smile. Then it happened. The lobby was strangely deserted. The world had a dull, far-off sound, like the interior of a storm before it erupts. Kane's hand went to his jacket. Phyllis stopped. Kane. She shivered in terror that she had finally pushed someone too far. Not out of fear of dying but out of fear of meaning. Between them a rifle raised. Phyllis gasped for air. Kane. Avoid being absurd. You are not a killer. Kane's voice cracked like broken glass, and his eyes were suddenly watery. You killed me first. He was referring to the emotional version of himself that he had spent years rescuing. The trust was what he meant. The battle. The reconstruction. Then the silence was broken by a single shot. Like a breathless scream, the sound reverberated up the elevator shafts, down the corridors, and out into the chilly night of Genoa City. Phyllis collapsed backward onto the marble floor, her face turning red like a stain that had been waiting to show. There were gasps, voices, yells, footsteps running. Kane's look was a peculiar mix of nothingness and destruction as he stood there, staring down at her body while holding the pistol lifeless. He didn't flee. He didn't run away. He didn't conceal anything. He just gave the gun to security when they showed up. Call Christine Williams, he said in a hollow voice. I'll give my statement, tell her. Since Kane wasn't trying to dispute it, he wasn't resisting. It was the only justice he thought Phyllis would ever experience. News spread like wildfire in a matter of minutes. When she got there, Summer's scream reverberated through the hallway. Disbelief broke every line in Daniel's face as he collapsed next to her. The weight of losing yet another member of his broken family made Jack gasp for air, and he fell into Ashley's arms. Nick Newman stood motionless, gazing down at the woman he had spent decades fighting, battling, forgiving, and loving. He cried quietly. Sharon was standing behind him, holding him up with a gentle touch on his back, not to console him. Lily showed up at the police station as Kane was being processed, his face pallid, his eyes troubled but composed, and his wrists bound. The world came to a halt when their eyes locked. Unbearably heartbroken, but neither angry or terrified, she approached him slowly. Kane, she said in a whisper. Why? With a shaky voice, Kane answered. Because I couldn't let her destroy us again. Lily shut her eyes. She cherished him. However, love had its boundaries. Even in the city of Genoa. It would be trial time. The consequences would be disastrous. Every friendship, every family, and every past entwined with Phyllis Summers would be shattered by the lines of loyalty. Kane is considered a monster by some. Some would describe him as a damaged man who had finally transcended human limitations. And once more, Genoa City would never be the same. However, one thing settled into the air like smoke that would not go away as emergency lights flickered red and white across the lobby floor. Phyllis's body was covered and removed, and reporters gathered like vultures surrounding the freshest wound. Payment is usually required for secrets. And at last someone had paid with blood this time. Following the shocking and tragic death of Phyllis Summers at the Grand Phoenix, Genoa City felt as though it had stopped breathing. The news reverberated throughout the entire city, from society to Chancellor Winters, from the boardrooms of Newman Enterprises to Crimson Lights, and no one was able to avoid its devastating echo. Within minutes, the terms brave and brutal made headlines in the media. Kane Ashby is arrested after Phyllis Summers was shot and killed. Some people thought it was impossible because Phyllis was a wolf, a fighter, a lady who had survived war, grief, manipulation, fire, and heartbreak. She was the type of woman who people thought could leave the end of the world without smudging her lipstick. Others believed it was inevitable since Phyllis had lived her entire life on the edge, taunting danger, controlling outcomes, pressing buttons, and wagering on the hearts and destinies of others, as though she were untouchable and unstoppable. However, the pain was too intense, too piercing, and too perplexing for those closest to her. Her kids, her lovers, and her adversaries who were once her friends. Summer Newman's voice was hoarse from yelling her mother's name into the echo of the hospital's antiseptic hallways, and she arrived too late. Looking down at the sheet covering his mother felt like an admission that she wasn't coming back this time. So Daniel stood there in quiet fear, his jaw frozen, his hands shaking, and his eyes fixed straight ahead. The memories of their love, their destruction, their rebuilding, and their final conversation. Sharp words laced with affection that neither of them could articulate anymore, came crashing in, sending a shockwave through Nick Newman's chest. Phyllis wasn't simply an ex or a problem. She was one of the last remnants of the past he held dear, flawed but true, devoted in her own perverse way. Jack Abbott sank into a chair in the hospital waiting area, elbows on his knees, his heart breaking. And Kane Ashby sat in an interrogation room, hands cuffed, staring at the wall, his face pallid, his eyes sunken. Not furious anymore, not aggressive, just hollow. While the hospital whirled with shock, anguish, and the assembly of families attempting to make sense of the unthinkable. Kane didn't appear to be a heartless killer. Rather, he appeared to be a guy who had lost everything, including himself, and every cop who passed that glass pane hesitated for a second. Slowly, with files in hand and a steady but gentle voice, Christine Williams came in. She was aware of Kane's past transgressions, his efforts to change his ways, and his intense and passionate love for his family. She murmured softly, "Kane." But he didn't look. "You recognize how serious this is. You realize what comes next." Kane's jaw tightened as he gave one nod. His voice was raw and strained as he murmured, "I'm not fighting it. I succeeded. I shot her. I will not retract my actions." Christine kept a careful eye on him. "Kane, but why?" He finally spoke, not in rage but in devastation, after a long oppressive stillness. "As she intended to take everything away from me. Once more. And I wasn't going to make it through this time." Lily Winters across town was caught between anger and heartache. She had believed in Kane's metamorphosis and had supported him through betrayal, addiction, divorce, forgiveness, and rebuilding. Once more she had picked him. And now, with her hands shaking and each breath hurting, she stood outside a police station. Devin and Nate stood with her, uncertain of how to support her, as Lily was mourning not only for Phyllis but also for the person she believed Kane had turned into. Her voice cracked as she murmured, "I thought he was past this. I gave him my faith. I allowed myself to believe him." Devin, however, who was always the calm voice of reason, put a hand on her shoulder. He whispered, "People don't change in a straight line. Occasionally they fall. They break occasionally." Lily gave a head shake. "However, this isn't only a drop. This is..." She was also unable to complete the phrase, for the truth was too terrible to speak out. In the meantime, Summer Newman was changing. Not into the distraught daughter that everyone had anticipated, but into something icy and lethal. In her mother's penthouse, she stood in a suffocating silence and gazed at the deserted living room that had once been filled with shouting, laughter, treachery, love, and a fire that had never gone out. Uncertain of the version of Summer he might discover, Kyle Abbott entered the room in silence. She refrained from crying. She didn't yell. She didn't pass out. Instead, her eyes seemed to be cut out of glass as she turned to face Kyle. "She was taken from me by Kane," she stated bluntly. "I will therefore take everything away from him." Kyle gasped. "Summer, please." But with a voice like steel honed by fire, she interrupted him. "I'm not requesting your consent. I'm telling you. Because, although she didn't burn carelessly like Phyllis did, Summer had inherited her mother's fire. She was coldly angry, calculated, planned. At Chancellor Winters, rumors spread like wildfire across the corridors. When Lily died, the staff fell silent. Devin conducted board meetings, looking toward the door every few minutes as he waited for Lily to come back after she left to take a breath. In addition to being Lily's spouse, Kane was also a co-parent, a business associate, and a guy who had been accepted back after years of struggle for change. Every client, investor, and partner now demanded answers. And Jill Abbott came like thunder, angry, devastated, maternal, and explosive all at once, while Lily stood in the center of a collapsing storm. Jill slammed her fist on Lily's desk and whispered, "He threw away everything," her eyes welling with tears. "He rebuilt everything. Everything he battled to establish. For what purpose?" An angry outburst? Lily remained silent, because she was unsure if it was only anger, or perhaps something more terrible, irreparable, or damaged. Then the unexpected shockwave arrived. A video appeared. Security footage taken in the lobby of the Grand Phoenix. Kane is being approached by Phyllis. Phyllis was taunting, sneering, and confident. Phyllis whispered something cunning, something cruel. Then Kane, shattered, trembling, came for the rifle. The city exploded. Because Genoa City was now discussing whether Phyllis's death was murder rather than if Kane killed her, or the last detonation of a protracted, terrible conflict between two individuals who had ruined one another for an excessive amount of time. Nick Newman was filled with wrath as he saw the video. More times than he could remember, he had stood up for Phyllis. He was more forgiving of her than anyone could be forgiving of another human being. He now had to confront the indescribable reality that Phyllis had gone too far, and would never be able to turn back. She had been pursued off the edge by Cain. Nick's fists were clenched so hard that his knuckles were white as he stood outside society, gazing into the darkness. Because she knew grief better than anyone, Sharon moved to stand next to him, breathing with him and not saying a word. She muttered, "Don't let hate destroy you." At last Nick's tear dropped. It is already. Later, however, was the most terrible scene. Grief hung between Daniel and Summer like smoke as they sat in silence. At last Daniel's voice cracked. She wasn't flawless. She told a lie. She was manipulative. She ruined things. However, she was our mother. With a long nod, Summer finally let her tears fall. We must now live without her. And Cain said to himself in a voice so hushed no one could hear, someplace in a silent holding cell, "This is not what I wanted. All I wanted was for her to stop." However, fate was already at work. It would be trial time. The coalitions would change. Families would disintegrate. And even in death, Phyllis Summers would continue to influence Genoa City, whether she was liked or not. Because here, secrets never remain hidden. And this was just the start. When the autopsy report was finalized and quietly released to the authorities, Genoa City was shaken all over again, because the truth about Phyllis Summers' final months was far more tragic than anyone had imagined. She had been dying. Hidden beneath the fiery outbursts, the erratic decisions, the desperate schemes and emotional spirals, there was a secret illness consuming her from the inside. A rare and progressive neurological condition that affected both memory and emotional regulation, slowly stripping away stability, clarity, and control. The doctors determined that she had likely been experiencing symptoms for more than a year. Tremors she hid behind tightly clasped hands, skipped words she masked with rapid speech, moments of panic she disguised as indignation, and worst of all, the emotional volatility that everyone in town had dismissed as just Phyllis being Phyllis. She had carried it alone. Not Jack, not Nick, not Summer or Daniel, not even her closest confidants knew. And that truth spread through Genoa City heavier than grief, heavier than shock. It spread as regret. Summer Newman, who had been holding herself together with righteous fury and ice-cold determination, finally broke when she heard. Her knees buckled beneath her in her mother's hotel room, the same place where they had argued so many times over the past year. Arguments that now replayed in her mind with horrifying clarity. She saw every moment where she accused her mother of being selfish. Every time she turned away. Every time she sighed in disappointment instead of reaching out. Daniel sat silently, head in his hands, replaying the last conversation he had with Phyllis, remembering how frustrated he'd been with her intensity, how he'd begged her to just stop, never knowing she could not. It was Nick Newman who stood the longest without speaking, leaning against the counter at Crimson Lights, staring into the middle distance as Sharon quietly made tea that sat untouched in front of him. Nick had loved Phyllis deeply, in ways that even time and breakups could never truly erase. And now he had to face the brutal truth that he had walked away from a woman who had been fighting a battle no one else could see. Jack Abbott was perhaps the one who shattered hardest. He went to the Abbott family mansion, closed the door to his study, and didn't come out for hours. Because Jack remembered the exact moment he told her that he didn't know who she was anymore. And now he understood that she hadn't known either. Lily Winters felt something crack inside her when she heard the report, because part of her grief for Phyllis broke open into compassion, but another part of her grief for Cain became unbearable. And Cain heard the news alone in a cold interrogation room, Christine reading the findings aloud, her voice steady but her eyes softening. His face drained of color, his breath came sharp, his hands trembled in the cuffs. He whispered, "She was sick," without fully breathing the words. And when Christine nodded, the world tilted. Because now Cain was forced to face the reality that the woman he killed, the woman he believed was trying to destroy him, may not have been in control of herself at all. And if she wasn't, then everything he believed when he pulled that trigger collapsed into tragedy. He hadn't killed an enemy. He had killed a dying woman who was already losing herself. That truth swallowed him whole. As the news continued to circulate privately through the families, guilt became the dominant emotion in town. Even those who had despised Phyllis, who had judged her, fought her, resented her, now felt an uneasy silence in their ribs. Abby Newman, who had avoided Phyllis for months, cried quietly in her office, remembering every jab she'd thrown back. Kyle Abbott held Summer as she sobbed into his chest, realizing that grief and guilt together create a pain unlike anything else. And through it all, the question forming across Genoa City was the same. Why didn't she tell anyone? Some said pride. Some said fear. Some said she wanted to control the story of her life, to keep being Phyllis Summers, the woman who never bowed, never broke, never showed weakness to the world that always demanded she be strong. But those who knew her best understood the truth. She didn't want to become a burden. She didn't want her children to watch her fade. She didn't want Jack or Nick to look at her with pity. She didn't want to stop fighting. So she forced herself to keep moving, to keep scheming, to keep burning brightly even as her own mind flickered like a candle running out of wax. And now, because of that silence, no one had the chance to tell her goodbye in the way she deserved. No one had the chance to forgive, or to ask for forgiveness, or to hold her hand while she confronted the fear she never let herself voice. Phyllis Summers died in chaos, but she died fighting, and she died refusing to be small. And now Genoa City would live with the memory of a woman who was louder than life, brighter than logic, sharper than fear, and tragically, heartbreakingly human in the end. If you'd like, I can now write the next chapter.